I would like to introduce you to the speakers. The first speaker is Safia, Dr. Safia Aidid, and I think you know her, all of you. Dr. Safia Aidid is an interdisciplinary historian of modern Africa and the arts, and a science postdoctoral fellow at the University of Toronto, Department of History. She holds a PhD from Harvard University. Her research addresses anti-colonial nationalism, territorial imagination, borders, and the state formation in the Horn of Africa, with a particular focus on modern Somalia and Ethiopia. She is currently working on a book manuscript entitled Pan-Somali Dreams, Ethiopia, Greater Somalia, and the Somali Nationalist Imagination. Please welcome Safia. Our second speaker is Dr. Tobias Hagman. He's an associate professor of international development and comparative politics at Roskilde University and the director of public culture lab in Switzerland. He is a political sociologist interested in state-society relations, land politics, and the development policy in the Horn of Africa and elsewhere. Our third speaker is Ms. Fawzia Abdul Qadir. I think she is online. Fawzia is a founding board member of Hankal Institute for Peace and Policy Development. Ms. Fawzia is also a founding member and a current chair of Somali Gender Equity Movement. And it was my honor to meet with her in Jigjiga and also with Juwairia. Thank you for inviting me to your conference as well at Jigjiga University. Our third speaker is Juwairia Ali. Juwairia is a doctoral candidate in politics and international relations at the University of Westminster, London. Her current research interests focus on the politics of nation and the state building in Ethiopia, human rights, colonial and the decolonial epistemologies, and the liberation politics in the Somali region. Juwairia is also a founding member of Hankal Institute in Jigjiga and has conducted extensive field research across the Somali region over the last few years. Our final speaker is Khalif Abdurrahman. He is a senior field researcher on the LSE, London School of Economy, I think, Conflict Research Program Somalia. He has conducted research across the Somali regions for the last 7 years, including Tufts University, Rift Valley Institute, and the Overseas Development Institute. So before I move to the second section, welcome again, and I would say in Somali language also, so dhawaada, minankiini waaye, ha ismartiyaynina. Okay, now it's the time to ask some specific questions for each scholar, starting with my right-hand person, Juwairia. A new government has been formed and Prosperity Party has won by a landslide. Does this mean that, contrary to the hopes of 2018, one-party rule has been reinstated in the Somali region of Ethiopia? What happened in the elections, Juwairia? Can you say something? And you have maybe 2 to 3 minutes.
Thank you very much, Dr. Yusuf. It's quite a heavy question to start with. What a way to start our discussion off. but a very important question. I think the short answer would be yes, unfortunately, but yes. And the reason why I say that I think we're back to a one-party state system is because of the context that the elections happened in at a national level, but also at a regional level. All of this, as all of this was happening, there was an expectation for an election to take place, and you can obviously see that that was not a conducive environment for the type of election which was promised in 2018, which was a free, fair and transparent one to take place. That's kind of at the national level, and in the context of the Somali region, the same processes were mirrored. So the Prosperity Party, the ruling party, had the entire state machinery at its disposal at the Somali region level, and there was no differentiation between party and state. I think that's a very important point to highlight. And all the things that make a society conducive for holding a free and fair election were missing. Actual competition, a strong civil society, free press, and so forth. And there's also a huge disparity between the ruling party and opposition parties in their ability to reach wider audiences. So a lot of the PP candidates, for instance, were also senior government officials, and they were able to utilize public government-sponsored gatherings to showcase or to campaign. These were platforms that were not available to opposition groups. They were also able to use state resources, vehicles, all those kind of things that opposition groups did not have access to. Then we have NEBE, with the lack of institutional capacity to act independently. It relied on the regional government to facilitate all aspects of delivering the election. So all of that was happening, and I actually think the opposition groups such as FEP and ONLF were actually very patient, and a lot of people are wondering why they didn't boycott the elections much sooner, given how things were playing out, the irregularities and the widespread misconduct that we saw during the election, the election process. And I think this election was an opportunity for Somalis to kind of realize their autonomy. It was not going to solve their long-standing economic, social, political marginalization, but it was going to be a start, and I think that hope has gone now. And I was actually there during the entire election period, and I can honestly say with confidence that the actual election took place in February 2021, I would say, and that's when PP was selecting its candidates. So there's this, we know that during the EPRDF era, elections were selections, but we need to ask ourselves how different was this time, because the competition was in February, it was not in September. So that's what I'm saying on that.
Thank you so much. We really appreciate your time and wonderful response. And now we turn to the online team. Khalif, are you there? Khalif, can you hear us?
Yeah. Yes, I'm here.
Okay, great.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you, yes. Khalif, your question is, what has changed from Abdi Ilay era to the Mustafa? How do you think? Can you say something about that?
Well, a lot have changed, really. Starting from a positive, there's certainly, I would say, more freedoms, both political and economic. For some parts of the region, at least, they are more economically free. There's much less, not comparable really, less violation of rights, which mainly comes actually from the way the federal government is acting. The federal government is not actually putting pressure on the region to do its violation now. So people are more freer from violation as well. The region itself in opposition of actually what's happening in Ethiopia as a whole, or in the Horn, is more stable. But also, on the other hand, the region is actually less autonomous. It looks like it's become more under federal government, be it through the PP or through a weaker leadership in the region. It's also less influential in comparison with other regions. Not that the Somali region had any so much influence, but it can't even fend off or argue well against what the Somalis see as actually other regions' influence through the federal government or from the borders itself. So in all, Somali regions seems to be doing well actually compared to what we have. And I'm not sure if we say during the Abdi Ile, but it's actually during the previous government, the federal government. The Somali region is always under the federal government, and when the federal government changes, things will change. So it's not, the crucial thing is not actually the government in charge at that time. Crucial government is the federal government in charge at that time.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Khalif. Really appreciate it. And now we ask our Dr. Safia Aidid. Safia, are you there?
Yes, I'm here.
Okay. Dr. Safia, Mustafa has said that he wants to bring the Somali region and the Somalis in Ethiopia to the national table, which is why the region's political leadership had to join and ally itself with the PPE. What do you make of this, Safia?
That's a great question. So I think Somalis in Ethiopia today are really in a sort of paradoxical position. They've certainly experienced the many changes that Khalif has talked about, that Juwairiya touched on as well, in that, you know, Somalis feel freer in the context of Mustafa's rule, right? Because, you know, they dealt with a very, although Khalif is correct to bring up that, you know, Abdi Ile was, of course, representative of the federal regime at the time. Individually, in terms of his style of rule, was much more repressive. And of course, this was related to the demands of the then EPRDF government. So Somalis experienced a bit of relief, you know, after 2018. But, you know, I say it's a paradox because on one hand, while Somalis do feel some freedom, some, you know, room to breathe, you know, in Jigjiga and the rest of the region, federally, we have to also look at what's happening, which is more repression, right? The Prosperity Party is a very different framework and a very different ideological perspective than the previous EPRDF rule. So, of course, as we know, ethnic federalism was a system that was instituted after 1991 and a process that Somalis were also a part of, right? This was not, you know, simply the TPLF and the other fronts that were battling the Derg regime, but Somalis, of course, played a role in that. And Somalis sat at the table when the new constitution was being drafted in 1991. When I was doing research in the region, you know, people were very clear that, you know, Somalis played a role in the drafting of the articles, and also very forcefully told me that they were involved in that specific article which talks about how sovereignty is vested and is enshrined in the peoples, the nation's nationalities and peoples of Ethiopia. So this is kind of a system, or was a system, where there's some ethnic autonomy. Of course, imperfect. We saw that with Abdi Ile's rule that, you know, the federal government, when it wants to, can have a very tight grasp on regions. But what we're seeing right now with the Prosperity Party is essentially a kind of systematic dismemberment of everything, the system that the EPRDF built, which was, you know, a very developmentalist state, which was one rooted in a concept of ethnic autonomy. What we have is a more unitary framework, or at least seeking to create a more unitary state, one that's also very neoliberal in its neoliberal capitalist, So very different, not only economic perspective, but also politically. So then the question is, what's at stake for Somalis in that type of framework?
Can you conclude, please?
Sorry?
Can you conclude your response?
Yeah, sure. So all of this to say is, I would ask, actually, if we're asking whether Somalis will be able to sit at the national table, the question is, will Somalis, as Somalis, will there be a region, will there be a Somali region in a future Ethiopia that's more centralist, that's more unitary? The question is then, what does that seat look like? When the very concept of ethnic autonomy, the very concept of these regions, the Somali region, is itself at stake. So I think that's something important to think about, that kind of paradox there.
Thank you, Dr. Safia. And now the question goes to Fawzia. Fawzia, how do people in the Somali region see the current war in the Tigray region? How do you think?
Can everybody hear me?
Yes, and you have 2 to 3 minutes.
Sure. Thanks, Yusuf. And I think it's a mixed bag of feelings, how people feel in the region about the war. War is always unsettling, and the Somali region has had its share, it's more than its share of upheavals. So there is a mixed feeling, I would say. And one part of it is what Khalif has said in terms of the region, and Juwairiya has said, the region is somewhat stable, relatively stable compared to the rest of the country. So there is a kind of like reality is always a mixed bag, but I think the Somali region is relatively peaceful in the sense also from what they have experienced the last 30 years. There's stability, there's peace, people are coming back. At the same time, the federal level sort of feeling and what is happening in the Tigray region is alarming at so many levels, particularly for the Somalis who have experienced, what we call qah and displacement. So you would see people who are scared and worry that the entire Ethiopian country might disintegrate tomorrow. Like when you listen to the coffee shop talks, there is apprehension at that level saying that, oh my God, this is going to fall apart any minute now. And there is also another mixed bag of feelings where it's like, okay, there is a bubble here and we are okay for now. Let's just wait and see what happens. But we're living in a serious contradictory terms and times because there is war and there are people getting displaced in Tigray region and there are mothers fleeing. But there is relative peaceful here and also in Addis Ababa. And so there is confusion. But I would say more of an apprehension of when will the next shoe drop type of fear, especially for people who are, historically have experienced displacement. So yeah, it's palpable, the tension and the apprehension that people feel about what is going on, because the last thing I think anybody wants is for Ethiopia to disintegrate, and it's not good for the whole region. So I'm going to just say that.
Thank you, Fawzia, for saving our time. Tobias, do you have any thoughts in relation to this response? Maybe 2 to 3 minutes, if you can say something.
Yes, thank you, Yusuf. So let me add 2 quick points. I think, the first question is, and that concerns Ethiopia, not just the Somali region, the question is, will there be a national table, right? And that very much was the hope when the transition period under Abiy Ahmed started. But at this point, it doesn't look like there will be a national table. And the so-called and often promised inclusive national dialogue is not happening, right? And if it happens, it's only nominal. And that is, of course, a major problem. And it just reflects the kind of bitter politics that have befallen Ethiopia, unfortunately. The second quick point concerns the transition period. There is a difficulty in assessing the so-called transition period, because it all depends on the kind of yardsticks that you use, the benchmarks, right? How should we measure the transition period? If we look at the transition period from a national perspective, I think it's very clear that the transition period is over, that it has failed, I'm not saying it's Abiy's fault only. Many political parties and political elites are responsible for that failure. If you look at the Somali region more specifically, the transition period has played out differently. So yes, the Somali region is much better off than before 2018 under Abdi, but that does not mean that the transition period per se in Ethiopia has worked. So it really is a mixed kind of picture.
Thank you so much, Tobias. And now we move in a very detailed questions for each speaker with 5 minutes. Please stick on your time. And we'll start with Dr. Safia Aidid. In your doctoral research, you looked at Somali nationalism from a historical perspective, specifically looking at relations between Ethiopian state and the Somalis in Ethiopia. When you compare the heydays of Somali nationalism in the 1960s with today, what has changed over time? And when it comes to the Ethiopian state and the Somali community, Safia, how do you think?
Well, everything and nothing. I think it's very difficult to answer that, but we can speak, kind of empirically that, we've seen many different regime changes in Ethiopia, period. I mean, the state that Somalis first encountered was one of, the imperial armies of Menelik II. It was conquest, it was colonialism, and it was an experience of pillage very early on with no interest in actually building a state at the periphery, right? There was no interest in building state in eastern Ethiopia at that time. It was simply plunder. And then you have, of course, Emperor Haile Selassie, who was, very savvy, more interested in modernizing and kind of having Ethiopia, transforming this very archaic empire into a modern state. So he's the guy who really tried to kind of enforce boundaries. He was involved in having the boundaries with British Somaliland and Italian Somaliland actually implemented. Of course, that didn't work. They were interrupted by the Second World War. And, afterwards, and, even in his regime, just to add, at the time that Africa was decolonizing, when Somalia was decolonizing, he was actively trying to create a state that was kind of involved in indirect rule. So you kind of saw a deepening of rule in this region as the rest of the region was decolonizing. On the Somali side, of course, Somalia becomes independent in 1960. And that means a lot in terms of activating kind of this built-in sort of insurgent attitude in the region, this discontent with Ethiopian statehood. And many people look towards Somalia. And that's kind of where we have this moment of pan-Somali nationalism, the Somali Nationalist Project being one of building a greater Somalia. And, Eastern Ethiopia, the Ogaden, was one critical piece. In fact, I'd argue that it was really the cornerstone of Somali nationalism, not only because of kind of these historic ideas of opposition to Ethiopian statehood, this very different kind of Christian highland state. Somalis would invoke historic leaders like Ahmed Gure, like Sayyid Mohammed, all of these people who were from this region. And so the 1960s and 1970s, of course, the peak being the Ogaden War, was really a moment for pan-Somali nationalism and where people in eastern Ethiopia looked towards Somalia as a political alternative. So what changes? And really 1991 is a moment of dual collapse. You see the collapse of the Derg regime in Ethiopia, but also the collapse of Somalia, and therefore the collapse of the political possibility of Somali statehood and unification in that sense. And so you have Somalis in the region asking themselves, do we keep fighting for, a separate state, a separate state in eastern Ethiopia, Ogaden, whatever you want to call it, or do we participate in the Ethiopian political project, which was one that was more interested than any historical regime before it, more interested in a concept of inclusion, as I was talking about ethnic autonomy, giving Somalis a region. And Somalis did have a region, and do have a region, but of course one that was undermined historically in the last 30 years because of kind of this tension between kind of ethnic autonomy, Somali autonomy, and the state. And of course, that's something I can't answer in 5 minutes, but rooted in kind of a historical kind of suspicion of Somalis as, perpetual outsiders, people who can never be good Ethiopians, people who are porous, always looking towards Somalia, going in and out across the border. So Somalis kind of have that inherent suspicion about them and their concept of Ethiopian identity. So, I was more sure about the possibilities of Ethiopian citizenship prior to Abiy Ahmed, in that there was a framework, although imperfect, there was a framework for the inclusion of Somalis, and then the project could be kind of having a more inclusive citizenship, fighting for equal rights within the framework of Ethiopian citizenship, But now, we have the resurgence of centralism, something that harkens back to the Ethiopian empire, to the Derg. You kind of see the sense of Ethiopian being one that's, very unitary, focused on the federal state, and then a systematic dismembering of ethnic autonomy. So the question then is, what does that mean for Somalis? And I'm, as the speakers have, my fellow colleagues have looked at, it's been a moment of stability for the Somali region, but I think the stakes are much larger. And really, we're dealing with a moment of kind of an existential moment where we have to ask ourselves, what is the future for us as Somalis in a state that looks a lot more like the Ethiopian empire than one that accords for or allows for ethnic autonomy. So I'll leave it at that. I know that we're going to address kind of possibilities and futures kind of in the rest of this discussion, but it's important to ask what the stakes are in this moment.
Thank you, Sophia. You are really on time. Just 5 minutes, exactly. Tobias, that puts you in very difficult situation as well. So it's your turn now. So last year you wrote an article for Ethiopian Insight in which you actually argued that the Somali region has for long been a dual periphery, the periphery of Ethiopia and the periphery of Somalia. Can you elaborate that, please?
Yes, thank you. I think this notion of center and periphery is very useful to understand politics in Somali region of Ethiopia, as well as in other parts of Ethiopia and the Horn of Africa, and of course in the rest of the world, no doubt. If you look at political developments at national level in Ethiopia on the one hand, and political developments in Somali region on the other hand, you would sometimes see phenomena that might appear contradictory. So sometimes, when you go to Addis Ababa and everything seems peaceful and donors are celebrating the stability of Ethiopia, I'm not talking about the current moment, obviously, but previously, you would see massive repression, warfare, and many horrendous things going on in the Somali region of Ethiopia, right? As if it were not really a part of Ethiopia, right? So, this kind of periphery, yes, the Ethiopian state will always insist on its sovereignty, saying this is Ethiopia, but whatever happens in Somali region somehow seems to stay in Somali region. One sometimes has the impression. But then there's also the opposite. And I remember in 2005, after the elections, going to Addis Ababa, and the situation was extremely tense after the protests and the shootings after the elections. And I'd go to Jijiga, and it was peaceful, and people were, were happy, more or less, right? And it's the same again. So the kind of dynamics that we see is when the political center is in tension, when it's under duress, when it is fighting, as is the situation now, the periphery sometimes can be very peaceful and quiet, right? Again, that's what's happening right now, and vice versa, So this appears contradictory, but there is a center-periphery logic to these kind of so-called, some people call them the peripheral regions of Ethiopia. Another kind of peripheral phenomena during the period of Abdi Ile. Right? So Abdi Ile and his advisors and his regime, it was paradoxical, but it was the most autonomous kind of entity in Ethiopia. Right? I mean, ethnic federalism is a good framework, on paper. We all know it never really worked that way in reality. But at that point, during Abdi Ile, the only region, apart from Tigray, had some kind of real autonomy, basically was able to tell the federal government to, I'm not going to use the word, but, we do what we want, right? I mean, there were attempts to sack up the ILA. He would basically say, no, we do, you know. He was powerful enough. He was basically able to gain some kind of autonomy, a brutal autonomy, an autonomy based on rights violations and other terrible things, but he had autonomy, right? There's many contradictory kind of things in these center-periphery relations. What we also see is, of course, these kind of imperial legacies of state formation, to use a kind of complicated sentence. But they are still here in Ethiopia, and most of the current conflict in Tigray, in the current conflict in Oromia region, is driven by these imperial legacies. And these imperial legacies, these unresolved legacies of the so-called national question, they persist also in Somali region. Yes, it's more peaceful and quiet now, but fundamentally, in terms of what does it mean to be a Somali in Ethiopia, what does it mean? What does citizenship mean in Ethiopia? I'm not talking about the paper, I'm talking about reality. They continue to remain unresolved. So this brings me to the last point. I think the main, what can I say, challenge, problem, a bit maybe tragic, I can say, is the Somali region's kind of status as a double periphery, right? Somali region has always been a kind of periphery to Ethiopia on the one hand and to Somalia on the other hand. And that makes it extremely difficult, you know, to orient yourself politically, to organize. And I'm not saying people haven't done it, they have done it again, time and again, but it basically puts this kind of territory and its people in a constant kind of force field between different political entities, making it very difficult, given the political dynamism that this region has seen historically, making it very difficult to build a polity, to build up institutions, and to basically organize political life. And I think it's kind of tragic, and it's not tragic, but it's really unfair, because if you look at it, the Somali region of Ethiopia is at the heart of the Horn of Africa. It is like a platform connecting the lowlands with the highlands. You know, it can even connect, you know, Islam and Christianity. It connects through trade, through people's movement. It's at the heart of the Horn of Africa, and it really shouldn't be a double periphery, but it should be, you know, it should be recognized as the heart of the Horn of Africa. And as we all know, you cannot pull out the heart, because then the region or the human being will die. So I think that's the kind of perspective that I would like to, that I sometimes, you know, would like to remind people. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Tobias. That's a really good conclusion. And now we turn to Fawzia online. Fawzia, you've for long worked on and thought about transitional justice and how to deal with the past violence in the Somali region. Recently, you returned from Canada to Jigjiga. What are your thoughts about how justice can be found for all the evidence, for all the violence that occurred in the past, particularly during the Abdi Ilay regime? Who needs justice and how that can be done? Fawzia, what are your thoughts?
Thank you. Who needs justice? I think everybody does. But what is interesting about, or maybe fortunate or unfortunate, about this region is this region, as Sophia was mentioning, has a history that is specific when it comes to injustices, when it comes to blunders that has occurred. So the history of this region is laced with that. And when you think about transitional justice per se, you need to have a moment where you can say things have really changed. And now we can all look back to the past. What is more complex about this region's reality is the past is still unfolding. There are continuities in the Somali region. There was definitely a heightened injustices and abusive trends by institutions during the Abdi Ilay era. We have all kinds of reports about Jail Ogaden. You know, we have a saying that says, you know, mate ke udambeye ki hadda la sii waday. When you really think about the recent report about the Bayahau saga, people who've been political prisoners in Jail Ogaden, who've been transferred into a forced labor camp, there is a lot to unpack when it comes to transitional justice in this region. But also, what is also more complicated in it is this region was at the periphery and has been receiving systemic government-sponsored human rights violations for a long time. The worst of it the last 27 years, and particularly under Abdi Ilay's leadership. Now, with 2018, when the changes came, there was a hope, and a lot of people like myself came back. We're trying to do research on the ground here, but what is happening in the broader country of Ethiopia is kind of making things look dimmer for justice, and particularly for post-conflict justice, because transitional justice is actually dealing with the past. Now, the past is still unfolding. Another layer of complexity in the Somali region is because what was done through government institutions. And Abdi Ilay is the only person who got picked up and jailed for whatever happened the last 4 days of the week of August 4th, not what he has netted out when he was in charge. You have in the deeper structures of the regional government, people who were implicated in all those injustices still as part of the system. So there are contradictions in the sense that we are trying to unpack, and the current leadership is trying to sort of say, let's look at the victims, let's look at what we can be doing. They have even approved a reconciliation commission at a regional level. There is one at the national level. I don't know how effective it is, but they're trying at the local parliament level also to sort of say, حقيقة or whatever, fact finding, to sort of unpack. But they also have, as part and parcel of the system, people who were implicated because this were systemic. So when you think about transitional justice and you know that there are no clear sort of like a group that is perpetrators and a group that are victims, it gets really, unclear on how you're going to deal with all of this. But definitely a comprehensive transitional justice needs to occur here for two main reasons, in my opinion. One is, if this region is going to be an integral part of Ethiopia, it cannot be part of Ethiopia unless what has happened, A, gets acknowledged, and B, addressed. Because you have people who have been victimized, systemically marginalized, and abused in jails and tortured. So, and that whole insurgency, counterinsurgency saga that they have lived through the last 4 decades doesn't really bode well for people who can now then trust to be citizens of this country. Correct. So I think transitional justice and dealing with the past is really critical for the Somali region, as I think litmus test for the rest of Ethiopia and for Ethiopia writ large, because Ethiopia under EPRDF has really committed an institutionalized state-sponsored violence against many people, not just the Somalis.
Yes, so Fawzi, I think that's a good conclusion.
For this country to change, for this country to have a multi-ethnic, multicultural citizenry, a body that can trust that agenda, will have to have a way that what has happened gets to be acknowledged and dealt with, right? Because we are living in a moment where
Fawzia, can you conclude, please? Fawzia, can you please summarize?
In some parts of the country, maybe there is relatively peaceful and people are not being picked up in the middle of the night. But the rest of the country is still under, circumstances like that. So to think even transitional justice, you want to sort of say, wait a minute, Ethiopia is not on a solid ground for us.
Fawzia, can you hear me? Anyways, can you hear me?
But we need to kind of consider it for
Fawzia,
it to move forward. So that is the complexity.
Fawzia, can you hear me?
Sorry.
Okay. Thank you so much. It's not really easy when you control someone, you can't see them. But like Tobia or Juwaria, I can say stop. But that's the online, anyway, culture. We have to adopt it. So let's go to the Khalifa, another online question on 5 minutes, Khalifa, as well. You have regularly visited the Somali region in the past and also followed the political and the conflict resolution processes in the region in the past decade. The diaspora has played an increasingly important role in the region in terms of development and investment, but also in terms of politics, as many of President Mustafa's advisors are diaspora retainees. How do you see the role of the diaspora when it comes to the Somali region? And what are different positions, agendas of different diaspora groups when it comes to the Somali region, in Ethiopia? Khalif, can you please say something about that?
Yeah, diaspora. Okay. You've heard Tobias say that this country or this region is double free. You have also same problem with that, which is it is diaspora also double or triple or more diaspora actually. In other words, they are diaspora from different areas. I'll talk about that later. But the region have large diaspora. They do send money back. They have positive impact on livelihoods of tens of thousands of families. So they already do an immense work. However, this is double diaspora with other Somali inhabited regions. Some of them from Djibouti to Somalia to Kenya. There is also this diaspora actually is dispersed to those. And more importantly, many people from diaspora have no strong connection, personal actually, apart from the family, as many of them were born in Somalia or in Kenya or in Djibouti. And they have only a historic link when you look at it, or familiar link. Their understanding is limited. So that is an extra problem for the region actually compared to, let's say for example, if you compare to Puntland, people from Puntland have spent, almost they're focused on Puntland. They only go on Somalia as a whole for maybe 10% of their time or resources. But people from this region have actually less focus on the region itself. On top of that as well, the Somali diaspora is actually relatively new diaspora, which means it's still lacking resource, as not well established in its host countries itself. They have less skills, less connections, less capital, which is what makes you valuable to the country that you want to come back to. With less understanding of the region itself, you can see that their ability to come back or to do much in the region is actually much less than even usual diaspora in the region. If you compare them, say, for example, to the Tigrayan diaspora, which is much less, at least they're focused on the region only, and not in many places. But in here, the problem is also that focus. That is the position of the diaspora in the region in reality. But also they are not well organized. Not only not focused, but also not well organized. So there's no large diaspora organizations. And with ONLF back now in Chichiga, that organization that was going around is not there. However, they still do have local influence. They are also good dissenting voice when those at home can't actually air their voice because of repression or reason. So they still that voice actually. And another thing that they are is actually a meeting place. Diaspora itself is a meeting place for different parts of the country, people from different parts of the country. So people come from the south of the Somali region or north of the Somali region, they normally don't meet in the Somali region itself, but in diaspora, diaspora itself brings them together. So it's actually a good place to intermingle. And if you wanted to organize things, actually it's one of the best places to organize. So with less resources, less focus, less organization, you could say diaspora is actually, and now left back at home, so no pressing issue, apart from the fear or apprehension, as Fawzia put it, of what's happening up north. The diaspora is actually hibernating. They're not doing much. Your question was actually to talk about positions and agendas. I could say there's not much agendas going on now, apart from little charts, whether it's clan or even national level. And there's no actually big positions they're holding that you can see. So that's where I leave actually. Diaspora is not very effective now. It doesn't have much weight other than raise voice. There is a big problem. So to the Somali region, and they might be actually, if this continue, they might be putting almost all of their resources to the region next, Kenya, Somalia, Djibouti, wherever. That's what I would leave.
Thank you, Khalif. Really appreciate. And now it's one of the serious question is going to Juwairia. Juwairia, since November last year, Ethiopia has been sucked into the spiraling war in Tigray between Tigray defensive forces and on the one hand, and the federal government and the regional states militias on the other hand. The Somali region has also been a part of this conflict as the Somali forces were sent to the front. How do Somalis in the region see the Tigray war? And more broadly, what is there under your take on national developments in Ethiopia today? In other words, what will be the role of the Somali region in the national Ethiopian politics given the Tigray war, insurgency in Oromia, and the massive polarization between nationalists, those wanting a strong central government, and the ethno-nationalists, those wanting a federal state structure with autonomy of ethno-linguistic groups? Fawzia, can you share with us something? Juwairia, sorry, my apologies.
I don't think I'll do justice to this question in 5 minutes, but to start with, I think these contested narratives on how the state should be organized have always been present in Ethiopia. And historically, different groups have come to power through undemocratic means. I think what's adding to the extra layer of polarization now is that you've got this elite that's pushing for a democratic transformation and other forces that want to maintain the status quo. And so historically, political differences in Ethiopia have always been resolved through the barrel of the gun. And the situation in Tigray with the TPLF today, I think, is no different to that. And it's a systematic problem which speaks to the way that the government chooses to settle political differences. And I think if it was not TPLF, it would have been any other group if they had displayed the same characteristics that TPLF displayed in terms of posing a formidable military challenge. It happened to the groups that I feel posed a significant political challenge, like Oromo opposition groups, namely Jawar Mohammed, and others who find themselves in prison today. So I don't think it's something unique to TPLF per se, but I feel that these conditions resulted in the government behaving this way. And the government was predisposed to behaving violently. And one of the reasons for that as well is the lack of institutional reform, is the same repressive institutions that the government has inherited, which the state is now deploying to settle its political differences. Of course, the Somali region is not removed from the events in the north. The economic ramifications of the war is having an impact on the day-to-day lives of Somalis. The cost of living has risen enormously. And when the Somali regional state sent Liu forces to take part, there was a widespread concern across the Somali communities, not wanting to become entangled in a war which they felt did not concern them directly. And touching on the, what's important for Somalis today, I think institutional reform is very, very important. We often hear that Somali region is a success story, is relatively peaceful, but the question is this peace durable if the institutions that would ensure that this peace remains, that would ensure a non-repetition of past abuses, if they're not reformed and if they're staying in place just as they were before. And we heard from the other panelists on this move towards centrism, and I think it's a scary time. I think a very concerning time to be a Somali in Ethiopia, who've historically been on the margins of society. But now, when you hear the one thing which I feel Somalis hold dear, which is the federal system, and when you see that under threat, it threatens your entire existence, I feel, essentially. And we're seeing that come to play more in the government's propaganda campaign against the TPLF. So now we're seeing, in demonizing the TPLF, there's also a demonization of the TPLF's legacy, which is the ethnic federalist system. So we're seeing the government blame Ethiopia's current problems, blaming it on the way that the state is organized, blaming the TPLF. The TPLF must be dismantled, along with its legacy, which is ethnic federalism, which is responsible for the situation in Ethiopia today. And I think for Somalis, in their long struggle for self-determination across the decades, across various different Ethiopian regimes, I think the current federal system is the very minimum they were able to attain. And I think they hold that very dear. And I think this is across the political spectrum, whether it's the ruling party Somalis, whether they're owner-left Somalis or non-politically affiliated Somalis. I think this is one thing that Somalis have in common, I feel. And one of the interesting, and I think also, again, worrying things about this time that we're living in now is, according to Nebe, up to 5 million people signed up to register to vote in the Somali region. We can debate the numbers, but up to 5 million people registered to vote. And on the night of the election results, the most, the hottest question was, who's Abiy going to name as president of Somali region? So 5 million people just supposedly voted, but we're asking ourselves, who is the prime minister going to nominate as president? And I think that's very, it speaks to the system that we're living in. It speaks to the continuity in political behavior, the culture of politics in Ethiopia that we have today. But I think those are some of the kind of key issues, and also with this debate, I just want to touch on what Safia's mentioned earlier on being on the table. I think there's this question among Somalis of, what does it mean being on the national table? What is a table, first of all? And then we can decide whether we're on it or not. Is it about numbers? Because if it's about numbers, then look at Oromo representatives who make up the bulk of the government. That didn't stop state violence over the past 3 decades happening in Oromia. It's not about numbers. And it's about, do Somalis have a substantive say in key national issues? Do they select their representatives at the federal level? Are they able to select their own representative at a regional level? Are they able to practice meaningful autonomy, constitutionally guaranteed autonomy? It's not a question of the legacy of TPLF, or if the federal system works or not. It was never given a chance to actually be implemented. We can judge whether it works or not once it's actually fully implemented. Those are just some of the kind of prevailing concerns, I think, among Somalis during this time.
Thank you, Juwairiya, for summarizing in just 5 minutes. It's such a huge topic. I think you agree with me. We had a very solid and terrific, panel. We like it really to listen for hours, but the time actually won't allow us. Finally, it was a really fantastic team, and they deserve a lot of sa'ab. Please.
So thank you all so much for a very interesting evening. I would like to give Adair Osman a chance, because this evening was also supposed to consist of an interactive dialogue. We wanted to speak with an elder from the region who has experienced various different major political events which have shaped the Somali region today. So in the 70s and so forth, Adair Osman was going to tell us about being imprisoned in 1974, the Somali youth in WSLF mobilization, how the Siad Barre government initially cracked down on them before later deciding to support the WSLF. We had a very interesting conversation planned, but unfortunately we're short on time, but I would like to give him an opportunity to share some final wisdom with us and how he sees things today and where we can go from here.
Bismillah, alhamdulillah. وبه نستعين على أمور الدين والدنيا. Thank you for giving me the chance to speak this panel, and thank you for the panel who arranged this, organized it. It was very important. I really appreciate your efforts to bring all these academic people together. First of all, my name is Osman Dibat. Maybe some of the people know us, and some of them don't know me. So I'm just introducing myself. Usually, all people likes to talk something in the past. So as I am the oldest person in this panel, I want to talk something about the past, which most of you doesn't know or didn't know it. Actually, I'm from this area, this Ogaden region, or the Somali state, as it's known at the moment. It has got so many names: Western Somalia, Ogaden region, and finally the Somali state. All of them right names. So I prefer to talk, something in the past. I left a small town by the name Aware when I was 15 years old, actually, and I left 15 years. When I left there, I was 15 years old, and the last time I went there back was when the change happened in Ethiopia, when Abdullah left, because I was blacklisted. So, on the other hand, I would like to talk about an organization that I was with, a member of them. It was called WSLF. WSF, it was the organization that was before the OLF. I was a member of that organization as well, but I was a student. So what happened was, during that time, there was Siad Barre ruling the country, and it was a dictator in a policy state, So nobody can hide it. So what happened was, as a group of students from all the region, not only the Ogadenis, we formed organization, a network, students, and uprising the government. Our aim was just to allow the government to take the blanket of the OLF, the WS, which was hidden, because government, Siad Barre, didn't allow even the WSF unless we uprise, unless we make the uprising. So what happened was, about 400 students, including me, were arrested in 1975. So they were collected from everywhere, from Kismayo to Barawe to Afgoye, from Barawe, from Kismayo, from Mogadishu, all secondary schools. That was when I finished secondary school. So what happened was, we were arrested, and because we were making, a secret students network asking the government to let the OLF work in legal way, which Siad Barre didn't like it. So we were, you know, arrested, all of us. About 400 students were arrested, including me. I was active member of that organization. So what happened was, we thought that nobody knows us, and we were working secretly. But at that regime, no one can hide it. No one. Because, you know, most of the people were agents of the NSS. Now, what do they call now NSA? Or, you know what they call, what do we call now? NISA. So that, maybe half of the population was NSS, National Security Services. So we thought that nobody knows that. But we were followed from the beginning. So what happened was, we were attacked at night when we had a meeting in one of the houses in Mogadishu. We were bundled into cars, police vans, big lorries, call it, brought from Germany, provided by Germany. It's called Gari Bueno Police Kulanchiri. LG, I think. It's called LG. We were bundled there. So we were taken back to, to prison, different stations. So people were brought from Kismayo, from Barawe, from Afgoye, all secondary students who they thought they were from that area. We were collected. So we spent about 8 months in prison. No question asked. When you ask why we were arrested, we were asked only the order come from the president. And nobody can talk to you. You are from, you know, your order come from the president, from the high top. So what happened? Maybe most of you heard about what happened recently to Qalbi Dagah. So I'm just reminding you that there was Qalbi Dagah before that. You know, the WSF produced it or formed to OLF, changed it into OLF. I was also a member of that. So I was blacklisted in Ethiopia. I didn't go back to my country. Only when when the change happened, or when Abdillah was thrown out, I went there. But I was expecting that when I went to Jijiga, I thought that everything will change overnight. To my surprise, I found the same thing. Only one thing was different. People were free to speak. People were free to speak, yeah? And there was no killing. There was no jail Ogaden. But nothing else. Ethiopia is Ethiopia. Ethiopia is Ethiopia. I found that the services are monopolized by Ethiopians, not the Somalis, who says, I am the Minister of Information, I'm the Minister of Security, and so, nothing. So, for example, airlines. If you go to airlines, Ethiopian Airlines, you will find no Somali. If you go to the bank, you will find no Somali. If you go to telecommunication, you will find no Somali. Nothing. But it's only by name, changed Somali state. So I was really surprised. Okay, what happened was I went back to my hometown, Aware, where I left when I was 15 years old. To my surprise, I recognized every part of the town because nothing changed. Nothing. Leave alone development, but it decreased. It decreased everything, nothing. It was better when I left, to be honest. And I saw, okay, I said, okay, what's the change? I come to Jijiga, I found some of the people who were, you know, indicted to be criminals, waving the honor flag, or waving the Somali state flag. They were the criminals. They were the same criminals. So they were the same, they were supposed to be in prison or to be, you know, apprehended. But they are high in the street. They are just walking free in the streets. Nobody says. And when you say, oh, this is Mr. Hebel, Mr. X, Mr. X, why is he? Some of them are in the cabinet, with the new cabinet. Those people who are taking, those people who are taking our photos from London, sending to Ethiopian securities, I found them. They are working and holding high posts. Do you believe? So and this is what I was surprised at. So I took you back just to remind you what was happening and what I expected and what I found. Thank you for listening.
Thank you all so much once again for coming. I hope we can keep these conversations going after the event, virtually, online, and so forth. Hope to see you guys again soon. Thank you.